You're listening to the K-Star Talk Radio Network, broadcasting truth around the world.
Riverside, San Bernardino, Inland Empire, and listeners around the world. Welcome to the Truth Seekers Radio Show. I'm your host, Angeline Marie. Thanks for taking the time to join us this evening. We're broadcasting from our flagship station, KCAA, 1050 AM, the station that leaves no listener behind. If you're located in the Southern California Inland Empire, you'll find us on KCAA 1050 on the AM dial. And if not, you can find us streaming on kcaaradio.com or talkstreamlive.com. You can also hear our program rebroadcast on LibertyWorks Radio Network at libertyworksradionetwork.com or on Red State Talk Radio at redstatetalkradio.com, and you can check their websites for broadcast days and times. You can also find podcasts posted on kcaaradio.com to listen at your leisure. And don't forget, you can always find out more about our show at truthseekersradioshow.com. Today, my guest is C. Fenner Goldsboro, and we're going to discuss his book titled Super Scam, Mega Fraud and the Misapplication of the Income Excise Tax. Mr. Goldsboro is a retired general insurance broker who was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and is now living in northern Michigan. He was a former chairman of the Free State Constitutionists, a Baltimore, Maryland-based organization dedicated to education of the public on the taxing authorities and limitations of the U.S. Constitution and the Internal Revenue Code. In particular, its violation by the Internal Revenue Service. Additionally, we'll be joined by his wife, Joanne. She's a former legal secretary, and as they travel around the country, she helps them with the teaching of Americans on this important information. Good morning, Fenner and Joanne. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, hi, Angeline. Good to be with you this morning.
Great. Listen, thanks so much for taking the time to share this important information with the listeners this morning. So, before we get started, I just wondered, Fenner, if you could give us a little bit of your background just so that the listeners, know where you're coming from, and then tell us how you got involved in the income tax issue.
Sure, happy to do that, Angeline. Yeah, going all the way back to the 70s, remember, I'm one of the members of the so-called old guard in the tax fight against tyranny indulged in by the Internal Revenue Service for these many years. And I'm going back all the way to the early 70s. And at that stage of the game, a bunch of us in Baltimore, Maryland, became interested in this subject, and we formed Free State Constitutionists, of which I was chair. And we used to give these presentations not only in Baltimore, but we traveled throughout the country when we learned about the scam. And finally, after the many, many years I had in working this fight, as we call it, the war against tax tyranny, I decided finally in 2010, after my retirement and my move to northern Michigan, to get to know my 7 great-grandchildren up here. By the way, I'm 86 now, so I go back a long way in terms of the years I've been involved in this fight. And I decided to write my book, Super Scam, which is this expose, as you noted in your introduction. And that is, I think what I'd like to do, if we get started with your permission, is just to try to give a quick thumbnail summary of Super Scam so that your audience will have an idea what we're all about. And then we'll also, of course, by reference to my website, give them an opportunity to pick up a plethora of information, a wealth of information about what the subject we'll be discussing. In the couple hours that we'll have to do this, we're not going to be able to cover the subject in its entirety, needless to say, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to give your listeners enough information that'll stimulate their enthusiasm to learn more and learn how they can stop paying what they'll learn from my book, Super Scam, that they have never owed, and give themselves a big raise. Let's look at it that way. Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds good, Fenner. Go ahead.
Okay, let's first talk about the book. My book, Super Scam, is a compilation of information contained in the thousands of flyers that we at Free State Constitutionists wrote and distributed all over the United States during the past 40 years. Now, none of the information contained in these detailed flyers has ever been challenged by lawyers from either the Justice Department or the Internal Revenue Service. Angeline, I'd first like to briefly summarize the contents of my book, which explains, of course, why almost all American citizens, not 90, I would say better than 99%, have never owed an income tax, and how they can legally stop paying a tax that they have never owed, but have been deceived into believing that they have owed for most of their working lives. Now, some people, some of our citizens, pay from a false belief that it is patriotic to do so, and that's very understandable. But most pay from fear of IRS's vigorously threatened consequences if they don't. Simply stated, most Americans have been bamboozled, terror-stricken for decades into believing IRS propaganda. And that is, of course, that the law requires them to pay a tax on their earnings or other receipts. And my book proves why this is not true on two distinct counts. And before I discuss those accounts, let me give your listeners access to my website, and I'll try to do that very quickly so that they will know that there is this wealth of information available there. And the website is at www.super, that's S-U-P-E-R, -scam, S-C-A-M, at superscam.com. And the website, if they want to access my website, that's the information that's necessary. Let's talk quickly about, get back to my summary. Chapters 1 and 2 of my book, Super Scam, explain why the tax is prohibited by our Constitution. And second, the statutory law itself is embodied in Title 26 of the Internal Revenue Code, and this totally supports the constitutional prohibition when it is carefully read and understood. Super Scam analyzes the key sections of the Internal Revenue Code in detail in chapters 3 through 7, and then a valuable tool for the a reader to protect himself against any criminal prosecution and possibly IRS civil collection efforts as well, is described in Chapter 8. Chapter 9, this is the last chapter of the book, provides 14 of the most frequently asked questions and answers. That's the Q&A section on the subject matter of the book, pointing to more detailed response, of course, to each question in a chapter-by-chapter designation. In a prologue, a preface, and an epilogue in the book provide a meaningful introduction and conclusion. The epilogue detailing my solution, which would have a far-reaching positive effect not only on our nation's current failing economy, and I don't think there's any argument about that, but on the well-being and happiness of our people. I suggest to your listeners that the preface, prologue, and the epilogue should be read first for those who want to buy my